Funnily enough, I will play for you something that I will probably ask you later to give us your comments about, which is a traditional plena from Puerto Rico, but played by Puerto Rican migrants to Hawaii. Is it alright? Great. Rico, ¿el teléfono lo tienes apagado?
What's the instrument?
Sorry?
What's the instrument?
I think that should be an Hawaiian block guitar or something.
It's softened, and the softening of the plane is very obvious.
Just with this, right? I don't know, just be careful when you kind of, not you, but anyone. You press the space bar, it stops recording.
I know. Ibero traditional music on Hawaiian plantations. That's the title of the album where this track called Plena is taken from. It's funny because me personally didn't ever think about these Puerto Ricans in Polynesia. What's that? Did you recall anything in regards to this?
Oh, sure. Well, you know, the first thing to say is much bigger even than Puerto Rico or the Caribbean. If you ask me what was the single biggest demographic lever in the history of the world, I would say sugar. It moved 13 million Africans out of Africa during 350 years. And among the tiny little movements that it made of people, it moved Puerto Ricans to Hawaii. There was one little thing.
Yeah.
Now, Puerto Rico had a long ethnic succession of Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, all of them working in the sugarcane. And when the Puerto Ricans were brought in, though they didn't know it and no one told them, they were being brought in as strikebreakers, as rompehuelgas.
Okay.
And that's been one of the reasons that their lives in Hawaii had been so difficult, because they really didn't know that. They were used to break the strike of Japanese sugar workers in Hawaii. And they came at a very early time. They came really before the United States was fully in control of Puerto Rico. It was a very early migration. And they were taken to New Orleans, then overland to California. And during that trip, some of them got away and took off. They didn't go to Hawaii. But I was invited by the Hawaiian Puerto Rican community to come and talk with them, and I had a wonderful visit to Hawaii and saw a lot of people and met them and taught them some songs in Spanish. They have chartered trips as tourists to Puerto Rico because they clearly remember and care about their ancestry, and they have photographs and all kinds of mementos. So it's very interesting to see how they've managed to keep their cultural continuities alive there. Of course, intermarriage wipes out a lot of that, naturally. And so many of them are complicated in their ancestry, and as you'd expect in Hawaii. But yeah, they were one of the first groups to be brought in, but they came after a number of others as well. And they still retain some sense of collective identity. I was invited because I was in Washington, D.C. giving a talk to celebrate a book by a good friend, a great photographer, not Puerto Rican, but considered Puerto Rican because he lived so much of his life there, a composer and photographer named Jack Delano, as they call it, Delano. And Jack did a book called Puerto Rico Mío, and it had pictures of Puerto Rico in the 40s and then in the 1980s. So you could see the same people in the same pictures alongside each other. Wonderful book. And I came to talk on that, and afterwards a lady in the audience came up to me and told me her name was Blaise Camacho and that she came from Hawaii, and would I be willing to come to Hawaii to talk to the Puerto Ricans. And I jumped at the chance to go. So this kind of music shows that their music traveled with them and then got a few hula hoops put on it. It got changed a little bit.
Yeah, I couldn't tell really, but it sounds like a Hawaiian blocky guitar playing,
Yeah,
you know, the
yeah,
role of el cuatro puertorriqueño.
It's very sweet, compared to the what do you call it? Guichero, the guichero, which makes such a rasping sound, and of course the cuatro. So this is a very different sound.
Yeah. Now, I mean, most of your research and the things you have written about or talked about mention the African identity in these Caribbean islands. Although when we see Puerto Rico, and it actually happens when we see, for example, Venezuela, which we hopefully will talk later on, there is not exactly such a thing like we are blacks or we are Africans, although there is, but not in a level in which you can see it probably in Jamaica or in fact Haiti. However, there was a particular very interesting, one of my favorites artists from Puerto Rico called Ismael Rivera, who called himself an Afro-Puerto Rican, and he sang to his African neighborhood, sometimes called African neighborhood, sometimes black neighborhood, sometimes just La Perla, which was the barrio where he was born. So I will play just a tune called El Negro Bembón. I think we're now gonna go to Jamaica.
Okay.
And we had a very interesting look into Puerto Rico, but now we are moving to Jamaica. And just when we were listening to the track, you mentioned something that was important to highlight.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, because you were commenting on the fact that Africa reveals itself, manifests itself so differently in these different places. There is a kind of regularity or rule that I would like to point out to you. I said earlier that Spain was very uninterested in producing sugar, in having plantations, in building up export agriculture, that it was not to the interests of the Spanish state. And so even though in Jamaica and in Puerto Rico and in Santo Domingo and in Cuba, all four, the Spaniards brought slaves, they brought plantations, they brought sugar cane, they produced sugar. Even though all this was true, before the end of the 16th century, before 1600, all of them failed, because there was no support at all from the Spanish state. After 1600, around 1625, the British, the Dutch, the French, and ultimately the Danes moved into portions of the Caribbean which they took from Spain and started plantations and brought in slaves and were able to produce sugar to ship to Europe. And this makes the difference fundamentally between the Hispanophone and the non-Hispanophone Caribbean in terms of the African tradition. That I would say all of the non-Hispanophone societies, non-Hispanophone, are Creolized societies, and the Hispanophone societies are Creole societies. And for me, that's a big difference, because the kind of enormous importation of very large numbers of Africans under conditions of slavery, under those terrible conditions, with a tiny white minority of masters and drivers, that kind of picture did not appear in the Spanish islands until the 18th century, in Cuba after 1762, and in Puerto Rico after 1812 or 1815. So by that time, in the Hispanophone islands, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Cuba, you already had very large populations of physically intermixed people, white and brown people, descended from intermarriages between Africans, freed Africans, and Europeans. This never happened in places like Jamaica or Saint Domingue or the Dutch islands, because they didn't have that early white settler population. And so there's a real contrast in where blackness fits into the social system. It's not a matter of color, it's a matter of culture. that places like Jamaica have a very powerful African culture and a sense of themselves as African, which Puerto Ricans generally do not have, and many Puerto Ricans reject out of hand. So that difference is where we should begin when we look at Jamaica. It's a very different sort of place from, say, Puerto Rico in that way.
It is, and that